Welcome to Music 320. This is lesson number 1 in week 1. It's going to be a fairly short video. I just wanted to go over some of the history of this programming language you're going to be using this semester and go over a few of the design features of the program, and then perhaps talk about a few of the general programming concepts of computer languages and Max MSP in particular. So the computer world we're going to be working in over the next 14 weeks, is called Max MSP. It was developed by Miller Puckett in the mid-1980s. Miller was working at IRCAM, the Computer Music Research Center in Paris at the time, and it was named Max in honor of the computer music pioneer Max Matthews. You may remember hearing about Max Matthews in Music 319. He's generally considered to be the father of computer music. He was working at Bell Labs in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and he was the person who came up with the concept of digitizing analog signals in such a way that they could be converted back into analog signals. So that the whole concept of having audio, converting it through an analog to digital converter into numerical data, and then converting that numerical data back into an analog signal is something that Max Matthews came up with. So the program developed by Miller Puckett was called Max. It was commercially released by Opcode Systems in 1990, and later it was bought by Cycling 74. David Ziccarelli was the owner of Cycling 74, and the program continues to be marketed and supported by Cycling 74. Both David and Miller Puckett were together at IRCAM. In fact, I was working at IRCAM in the mid-1990s. At the same time, both Miller and David were working there, so I know both of them. I should also mention that Miller Puckett is the author of Pure Data, or PD. And Pure Data is a program, open source program, that has many of the same features as Max MSP. There was a time when the file structures of both PD and Max were equivalent, so you could open files generated by one of the programs with the others, but that's no longer the case. You may come across references to PD when you're looking up online for Max patches, and just understand that it's a similar program to Max MSP, but doesn't have nearly the same level of support, the same number of graphical interfaces, and nearly the same number of objects. So that's a little bit about the history of Max MSP. Max is now running version 8, and if you purchase Max, you'll be getting version 8, regardless of which method you use to pay, whether you get a subscription or buy the program outright or get the student version or student pricing on the program. So just some general features of Max MSP. It is what we call a 4th generation language, a 4GL. And it is built on a 3rd generation language, that being C and C++. So 4th generation languages are generally work at a higher level of abstraction and are built on 3rd generation languages. So in a sense, you wouldn't know it by operating Max MSP, but in fact, deep down inside Max MSP is a lot of C code. All of the objects are actually coded in C and C++. But you don't have to know that because someone has created a higher level abstraction that you can use as a user. It has an object-oriented design, although not all of the object-oriented programming language features are included in Max MSP. Things like inheritance, Max doesn't really support that kind of thing. It's not designed that way. But it does have the notion of data being messages and objects being instantiated, so you have multiple versions of an object, all of which reference the same code base but are independent of one another. It has a graphical user interface. it's not a text-based language. So no more worrying about where the missing semicolon is, or that where that bracket matches some other bracket, getting inscrutable debugging messages. All of that is gone with Max. And finally, in terms of design, it's what we call a data flow programming language, in which messages are passed from one object to another, and you control the paths that messages go on. So you're in a sense creating the data flow when you design a Max patch. So this is a Max patch here I've got, and I'm going to type Command E. That would be Control E on Windows, but I'll just say Command E, and you'll see down here that this will unlock my patch, and I can now edit the patch. And I am going to type a M for message, and I'm going to put type a value of 126 into that message box. That is a piece of data. Here is an object. I'm going to say plus space 100. I should have mentioned I created that object by simply typing an N for a new object. And then I'm going to type an I for an integer box. And I'm going to connect the output, the bottom of the plus object, into the top of the integer display box. And then I'm going to connect the bottom of the message into the top of the plus box. So this is what we mean by creating a data flow. Typically in Max, data flows from the top to the bottom and from right to left, and we'll deal with that more later. But basically think of it as always flowing down like gravity. 126 is a piece of data, it's a message, it gets placed into this object does something with that data, and it outputs the result, which gets displayed in this number box. I'm going to hit Command E to take us back out of edit mode and into performance mode, and I'm going to click on 126, and what you see is very quickly what I just described happen. A piece of data, a message, is sent down this pike. The data flows down here. It gets processed by this object, and this object does a calculation and outputs the value down here. If we want to pull this down and insert another object multiplied by 12, I'm going to hold my Shift key down and just pull that in there, and it actually inserts it in the middle. And I'm going to make this a little bigger to make sure we can see our result. And now I'm going to click on this, and there we get the result of 126 plus 100, then multiplied by 12. So, and you can see it doesn't really matter where these objects are relative to one another, provided that we go out the bottom of the object and into the top of the next object. So if I change that value by putting my mouse in it and click on this again, the calculation takes place. But of course we would never build a patch like this. We want to build things so they're nice and neat and clean. And there's our first Max patch. Now, I'll talk a little bit about programming concepts in Max MSP. And these are terms that I'll be using throughout the course, and it's important that we know what they mean. So the first of these is the concept of an object. And an object is the functional part of a computer program. It performs some action. And that action might be adding some numbers together, performing a multiplication of some numbers. It might be sending a note out to a MIDI device. It might be generating digital audio, a signal. It might be imposing an envelope. All of these things you can think of as a performance or doing some action. And they're done by objects. About 95% of your code in MaxMSP will consist of objects. There are thousands of objects in MaxMSP, and well, we'll get into all of that. You're not going to get to know them all, but you'll get to know enough of them that you can do some pretty amazing things. So I'm going to pull out Command E, type N, and hit plus to create an object. And this is an object that adds things together. The second thing in MaxMSP we have to know about is an argument. And in MaxMSP, arguments are a little different than they are in some of the other functional programming languages you may have come across. An argument we should think of as being a default value that an object takes. So in this case, it is the value 12. So I have a plus object, and a plus object is capable of adding numbers, incoming numbers, to some other number and producing a result. Well, what is it adding it to? Well, it's adding it to whatever argument I've put in there. That's the default value. So when I put a I number box here and I number box there and join them together, if I type 10 in here, it's added 12, 12 being the argument. A message. A message is synonymous with data. This is the information that is passed from one object to another. And we'll talk in the next video about data types in MaxMSP. But for now, let's just deal with numerical data types. So I'm going to type an M for message. And in my, I use a color scheme that allows me to differentiate very clearly between different objects. I'm going to put a value in here, a message, a piece of data, which says 125. So it's kind of like a fixed piece of information that I might pass from one object to another. Okay, and variables. Actually, I'm going to just show you if I put this in here and click on it, 125 is now passed into this object, and the result is 137, 125 plus 12. Variables. In MaxMSP, variables are generally represented by user interface objects which allow us to input variable data. So for example, this number box would be a variable because we can actually put our mouse in it, we can scroll around, and we can get different inputs and different outputs. I'm going to type Command N and type slider, and here's another variable. This slider I'm going to join up. By the way, I've got segmented patch cords turned on in my options, and that's why I'm able to click and make a nice square around the other objects. And you can see that this slider is capable of producing variable inputs. Graphical user interface, or GUI. When we talk about a GUI, we're talking about the parts of the program which provide an interface for the user, a way in which the user can put data into the system, and a way in which a user can visualize the output from their system. So this slider is an element of our graphical user interface, and this number box, which produces the results, is also a component of a graphical user interface. And we need both of those. We need ways in which we can interact with the program, and we need ways in which we can see what the results of our program are. An algorithm. An algorithm is simply a set of logical steps or instructions that are needed to complete a task. Algorithms exist in all kinds of things that we do. If we think about going to the store to get a liter of milk, we would say, well, what do you need to do in order to get a liter of milk and bring it home and put it in the fridge? Well, first of all, you need to get your wallet, and then you need to get your keys, and then you need to go out the door and lock the door, and then you need to walk down the street and turn right and walk down the next street, go into the store, find the milk, pay for the milk with money in your wallet, and so on. So it's not just computer programs that can have algorithms. All kinds of things can have algorithms. So think of this as, how do you solve a complex problem? How do you break it down into a series of steps and solve those steps one at a time in order to make a complex task realizable. And finally, just the last thing I wanted to mention in this introductory video is the whole concept of what Max allows us to do, the concept of interactive computer music. So in courses like Music 319, you use digital sequencers. And digital sequencers are, for the most part, fixed. You hit play and it plays back everything that you've encoded in that digital sequence. Max doesn't work like that. Max is essentially a computer environment, computer software environment, which is designed to be responsive. So when certain things happen, Max will respond. And so rather than having a fixed environment, you've got a responsive, interactive environment. So the kinds of things that might happen is that Max will simply be waiting for you to do something, to push a button, to move a slider. It might be listening, in quotes, listening to a sound, and it might be tracking the amplitude of a sound and doing things based on loudness. It may be doing something based on the pitch that it hears. It may be allowing you to do live mixing of multiple components, and so on. So rather than having fixed elements, you have interactive and responsive elements. So that's all I wanted to cover in the very first tutorial, just an overview of Max MSP. We're going to be spending a tremendous amount of time with this, and I hope you get to know this program extremely well.